What I'm working on today is a food vessel known as the Ballybit pot, an Irish pot, Bronze Age, and I'm starting off with a lump of fairly gritty clay. This one's tempered with grog. You get quite varied tempers in this type of pottery, but grog, crushed down old pot, is a good addition. Gives a little bit of mechanical strength when building, and rather than coil building as such, which of course is what one hears an awful lot about, what I'm doing is I'm essentially started off making a pinch pot. That will give me fairly quickly the basic form of the pot that I require. So I'm pinching it out and slowly working upwards to give myself the rough shape, a very rough shape of the vessel before I start to form it and decorate it. There we go. So basically it's a fairly fast way of forming the vessel, and you'll see that what I'm doing is I'm sort of forcing the clay upwards as I pinch and turn, and it's quite a rough process. And when you look sort of ethnographically at potters in Africa or South America or Asia who still hand build pots, often the starting point for the construction of a vessel, no matter how sort of well finished the vessel is at the end, the starting point is often quite crude, quite rough. I've watched potters in Africa start off with a lump of wet, soggy clay slapped onto a flat stone, hauled upwards in the most sort of rudimentary and rough way, producing what looks like it's going to be a lopsided, coarse, rough vessel, and end up with the most beautiful, spherical, polished, decorated pot at the end of it. So the starting point, as I say, is often quite crude, although it possibly looks more uncontrolled than it actually is, because all the time I'm doing this, what I'm trying to do is make sure that I'm getting a relatively even thickness in the wall as I work upwards. This pot is going to have decoration in the form of 3 cordons that go around it, cordons or raised ribs, and those raised ribs I'm going to start to pinch out once I've got roughly to the sort of basic size that I want for this vessel. This pot is recorded as in inches, as not I tend to work metric these days, but I think it's recorded as being 5 1/10 inches tall. Now, because clay shrinks as it dries and fires, I will be making the pot around about 10% bigger than that. So I'm aiming for that sort of size, and I will take measurements as I go on, but I have sort of got used to judging the size of pots fairly well by eye at this stage. I've been making pots for quite a long time. So yeah. So I'm getting sort of close to the sort of height, and you'll see that the form is starting to become more even at this stage. Now the original pot has 3 ribs, as I say, round it, and those ribs are pressed in. I've got actually a couple of pictures sitting here. Tend to have some photos sitting handy of the pots we're working. So that's what we're going to be aiming for at the end. But these ribs, as I say, I'm going to leave them raised up by simply working in between them and either side of them, and I can actually start that process at this stage. And what I've noticed is that the ribs on those pots are around about the length of my finger from the top. So if I start there working round the pot with that rim right into the crook of my thumb and first finger there, and I work round, I can immediately start to put in the cavetto zone that goes between the first 2 ribs And you can see that starting to form there now, that sort of hollow. And then again, I will do the same just above that to put in the next one, which is going to be up here. But again, that feels quite comfortable when I get my thumb crooked over the top there, bend my thumb so it'll press against my finger on the inside of the pot. And if I actually work around the pot like that, let's work in the other direction so as you can see what's happening there. As I do that, I start to leave that rib there. And then what I'll do at the end there is I'll come back and I'll work round here and I'll start to raise up the next rib. So after going round a few times, I will have raised up the ribs one by one by one that are going to form the pot. The lower rib will be down here, simply by pinching in between. And the advantage of that, of course, is that the clay from which the rib is formed is part of the main body of the pot. It's not going to easily fall off. And occasionally you do see where ribs are applied to pots or cordons are applied to pots and they've not been stuck on particularly well and they have fallen off. In the case of the Ballybit pot, there's no evidence of that at all, and I suspect that it was formed up from the main body of the pot. One of the keys to that is when you see broken pots and you can see pieces of the temper, the grit, etc., that is within the pot. If you get a nice big bit that passes from the main wall of the pot through into the cordon, you can be fairly certain that it's been raised up from the pot, because if you were applying a cordon of clay onto that, you would feel that big lump of clay, you'd get rid of it because it would be an inconvenience to you. Whereas if you're pinching it up from the pot, that can sit nicely inside there and you won't actually notice it. But there we go. We're building up those cordons one by one. Come back in a while and we'll have the pot with the cordons established and starting to move on from there. This has so far been pinched out from a single ball of clay, around about 1 kilo, which is a good weight to hold in my hand, so I can work quite happily with that. And literally that's been pinched out from a single lump, so no additions of coils or anything like that. The decoration has been also pinched into the vessel, if you like, as I went along. So simply using my thumb around what are going to be these cordons, pressing down the clay either side of them. Now, interestingly, for a person with a hand my size, these correspond with what I sort of call reaches. When I put my hand over there, pinching in that cavetto between those two cordons there corresponds very nicely with the length of my thumb on the inside and my fingers on the outside. So I worked round that, simply pinching it in to start with. The second cavetto, again, crooked fingers and pinch in. But that actually also corresponds really with my thumb. So working the other way around with my fingers on the inside and my thumb on the outside gives me that top cavetto. Again, what I'd term a reach. It's sort of the comfortable reach of your fingers when doing a piece of work like that. And I do find with a lot of sort of prehistoric pottery that when you start to look at them, they do seem to be designed obviously aesthetically pleasing, but also for the sort of comfort of the potter, if you like. Now, what I'm doing now is just working around and really establishing those cordons by, again, pinching in on either side of them. And having got them fairly well established at this stage, I'm going to start to work on the gaps between them, the cavetto areas, if you like. And that, you can smooth those down quite nicely by just getting your finger in there, using the tip of your finger and pulling it round. And what you end up with is a fairly nice smooth groove in there. With if you're getting your fingernail in at the edge, you sort of end up with a sort of indentation, a line. And actually in the original of the Ballybit pot, you can sort of see that indentation, although I suspect it's also been re-established with a tool. So I'll be doing that again later. So at the moment, it's going to be just carrying on working around this, working up the detail, trying to get it nice and even. And once I've done that, I'll come back with a scraper and work over the whole thing to really smooth it out and prepare it ready for the decoration. So I'm going to carry on with this for a while and come back later. I've now sort of established these cordons around the vessel to my satisfaction. I'm not overdoing it because the original vessel is not particularly highly finished. It's well finished, but it's not of a particularly high finish, so I don't want to go beyond what the original makers would have done. I was saying before about the sort of idea of reaches, the fact that sort of various parts of this pot fall within perfect reach of your thumb or fingers for a person with my hand size when working this. This pot is currently, it should be pointed out, around about 10% bigger than the original, because that's the sort of shrinkage level of the clay. So by the time this has been dried and fired, it will have come down to being that sort of size. What I'm going to do now is I'm using a pebble, a fairly smooth pebble, starting just to smooth down the surface. I sort of use this pebble at a sort of low angle, almost a sort of buttering motion, if you like, pressing down onto the surface. And what I'm doing is I am smoothing the surface, but at the same time I'm pushing the grit, because you'll notice this clay is slightly gritty. You can see the speckles on the surface. I'm pushing those particles of grit down slightly below the surface. And as I do that, I'm probably drawing across the surface a layer of slip, a little bit of liquid clay that's being generated simply by this scraping motion, laid over the surface of the grit. And because the surface sort of bounces back a little bit and the grit itself doesn't, it stays below the surface. And I suspect, although I have to say I've never tested this myself, that if you were to thin section a pot like this after doing this motion on it, that what you would see is a surface slip layer that would look a little bit like it might have been applied. So it's a sort of experimental area that I would like to look at some stage. The idea that you maybe are seeing an area, a surface that looks applied, but is in actual fact the result of self-slipping simply by going through this motion. And once I've done this, when I come to finish the pot, if I want to get a fairly high finish on the surface, wetting my hand and simply rubbing it over the surface of the pot smooths out this top slip layer to such an extent that it really does give you a very quite a fine finish just by itself without applying any extra layers whatsoever. So that's what I'm working on there. I'm going to do the same into the grooves here, these cavetto areas between the cordons, just to smooth those out a little bit. And you know, at this stage you've got choices of tools. I do find that this pebble that I use quite a lot, this is a pebble that's been with me for some time, so it's developing wear patterns on it that are interesting in themselves. And again, there's another potential area for investigation. A couple of archaeologists have said to me over the years, when they look at my toolkit, some of the pebbles and things like that in it would be discarded as being natural on most archaeological sites, because they just mix in with the rest of the sort of natural stones and pebbles that are on there. But actually this has developed through the scraping action. It's developed really quite a sharp edge in there, in that curve, and on the surfaces I'm guessing that were I to take a microscope to it, we'd find all sorts of interesting scratch marks, the result of the scraper working against the grits in the clay. So again, you know, lots of interesting areas for investigation. I suspect most prehistoric potters, as potters do today, would press into service things that they found lying around them as tools. And you know, my modern toolkit has all sorts of odd things in it that were never designed as potter's tools. I think, you know, there are tools which you know, I use things like bone spatulas. I use pieces of antler, which have to some degree been designed as potter's tools. But at the same time, when you pick up a bit of antler and you start to use it, the wear patterns that you build up on that piece of antler cause it to form into a tool. And that, you know, that in itself is I suppose interesting, that tools develop by the use of just a random object as a tool. Going to go around a little bit here and work a little bit on the rim. So working upwards. Now, you know, a couple of people have commented that it's in its early stages, this pot was looking rather like a collared urn. I think it's probably starting to look less so now that we've developed those three cordons there. And again, once the decoration is applied to it, maybe it will look less so again. But here we go. What we're doing is smoothing out various areas of this pot, and again using that low angled scraping motion over the surface. So I'm going to carry on working on this for a while. Again, come back and see what I'm doing in a while. So here we are. It's been smoothed out to as high a level as I think I want it for this particular pot. As I don't want it over refined because the original isn't. I'm about to start decorating based on images that I've got. So I'm starting with the comb impressions that go up over the rim and across the cordons. And in this case, I've made myself a little toothed comb, approximately the right number of teeth and approximately the right sort of width as the original. And I can straight away see that the decoration that's been applied over this cordon is applied at that angle, which is interesting because that's the perfect angle if you're right-handed. So as a right-handed person, to hold the pot supporting it on the inside, so as any pressure I put on the outside doesn't compress the pot, and apply the decoration, the natural instinct is to hold the tool like that, so you've got a little bit of pressure on the back, and you work in that way. So to work round like that and apply those toothed impressions over that rim all the way around the pot is going to be relatively easy from that position. And interestingly, the same is true of the ones that go up over the rim. They're at a slightly more vertical angle though, rather than at the quite the same slope as down here, which again, if I'm working comfortably, I'm supporting on the inside. Working across there would be a bit on the tricky side. Because I've now swung round slightly with my arm, actually working up over the rim again becomes most comfortable in that position. So I can again apply that decoration up over the rim of the pot, working all the way around in that manner. Again, it's something that I often find, that the angle that decoration is applied to pots is the angle that would be most comfortable to a potter working right-handed, left-handed, whatever, in this position, holding the pot with your hand inside, supporting the pot and working around the outside, just applying that decoration. So that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to work round the pot. I'm going to apply that comb impress decoration. There's then quite a lot of cutting to be done into the surface, and I'll come back and we'll do that. Okay, so I'm about to start to apply the incised decoration. I'm going to use an antler tool with quite a rounded end. The original incised decoration is really quite broad, the tip that's been used to do it, very roughly applied, so I'm not going to take very much care over the application of this at all. I want it to have the same quality character as the original. It looks to me, and I haven't got an exact number of this, but I've done a projection of this, and it looks to me like there are 5 composite chevrons going round the entire vessel. That's what I'm going to do. At the bottom there appear to be 4 around there, so that's what we'll be going for there, and we'll do it in, as I say, a fairly sort of coarse way. What I'm not going to try to do is I'm not going to try and replicate stroke for stroke. What I want is the same character as the original pot, not a sort of slavish duplication necessarily. I want this to have the same sort of feel as that original pot. So I'm going to be cutting these in a sort of similar sort of way. I've marked myself 5 points around the pot to give me sort of a rough sort of starting point, but I don't want this to be too slavish, I would say, to the dimensions and strokes of the original. I want it to have the same characteristics, and you'll notice that as I'm doing this, I'm sort of pulling off a little bit of clay each time, and I'm also leaving burrs on the side of these strokes, so those will need later to be taken off, but that can be done when the pot's dried out somewhat. You know, sometimes the original maker has sort of changed course in the way that these have been applied and not joined them very well. There are 4 parallel sets of these on the original, so that's where we're going. We're going for 4. Trying to replicate that same feeling of the original pot. Occasionally you find pots where the pot itself is extremely finely made and finished, and then the decoration is incredibly crude. And it's sort of interesting to look at that and wonder, is it 2 different people? Is it the pot maker was a very accomplished pot maker but not a particularly accomplished decorator? There we go. Going for that same feel as that original pot. And the final one, here we go. I'm fairly happy with this. This is starting to have similar qualities. Not particularly good joins, that's in keeping with the original. Sometimes when you see people replicating things, they tend to improve on it, and it's one of the things that I try not to do. There's also sort of just a quite light emphasizing of the edge of the cordons there around these cavettos in the original. It's not been, whoever's done it's not pressed on particularly hard. They've just gone round just sufficient depth to make it sort of emphasized. There we go. That's what I'm doing. And there. Trying to work quite quickly because again I want that same quality in this as we've got in the original. Surface quality. The Ballybit pot, and lastly, we seem to have a second ring, a ring round there. Then we've had a ring applied below that as well, slightly. I'm quite liking that. That's good. It's there. You'll see I'm sort of using this at a slope again, not using the point directly in as you would a pencil, but drawing it across the surface, which gives you a slight burnish to the bottom of the groove that you're applying. Now, here we go. Let's see where we get to with this. This seems to go from there up to there. Good. And again, down to there and up to there. Yep, that brings me around about halfway around the pot. That's good. Down to there and up to there. And then finishing down to there and up to there. As you'll see, that's not a perfect join, but that's quite likely where we would be with the original. And then those have been infilled with a number of incised lines like this. And that seems to be left completely blank in there, so I'm going to go with that with one more of those. There we go. Am I happy? Yeah. One too many. You can do a repair if you feel you've not got what you want. I don't tend to do that very often, but occasionally you just feel, yeah, it's not quite what I wanted. Those. There we go. I think that is pretty much our Ballybit pot. There it is. Okay. Yeah, fairly happy with that.